Black woman denied boarding. Stuns crew minutes later with surprise FAA authority reveal. Imagine standing at the bustling gate of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a first-class ticket in hand, only to be told you don't belong in the priority lane. Picture the stares, the murmured whispers, and the overwhelming sense of injustice simmering in your chest. Because you know you followed every rule, paid every cent, and earned every bit of respect you were promised. But instead of folding under discrimination, you stand tall. Unknown to those around you, you carry a power far greater than a boarding pass. This is the story of how one Black woman turned a moment of bias into a striking act of karmic justice. Ebony Baxter was no stranger to airports. At 28, she had traversed the nation more times than she could count, racking up frequent flyer miles that rivaled the most seasoned corporate travelers. What set this trip apart, however, was her mission. On paper, it looked like a simple journey from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. She had arranged a brief stay in Dallas before heading back to her office in Washington, D.C. Officially, the visit was labeled a last-minute operational review, but Ebony knew exactly what that coded language meant. She was there to assess flight operations for compliance with Federal Aviation Administration regulations. Her true purpose remained undisclosed. The public didn't need to know she worked for the FAA. Ebony had carried out this assignment many times, traveling in plain attire, blending seamlessly with the crowd. She had the calm demeanor of a veteran traveler, patient, composed, unbothered by sudden gate changes or delayed flights. She rarely faced obstacles, especially since she always booked priority boarding, often in first class, using a standard government contract designed to speed up surprise inspections. While she preferred to stay under the radar, having a first-class seat allowed her to move efficiently through the usual airport chaos. But that morning, something felt different. An unspoken tension in the air, like an invisible thread pulling events toward confrontation. Beyond her professional identity, Ebony carried the burden of personal history. Over time, she had become familiar with the sideways glances when she took her place in the first-class boarding line. Some assumed she was in the wrong place. Some asked, with forced politeness, if she was mistaken. Others were less courteous. She had learned to let it slide. Her role demanded grace under pressure. Her parents had instilled in her the values of endurance and dignity, especially when confronted with demeaning treatment. Yet no matter how often it happened, the sting of prejudice never faded. That morning, Ebony arrived at Gate A27 with time to spare. She never rushed through airports. It left no chance to observe her surroundings or notice procedural slip-ups. Early arrivals let her assess staff behavior, observe gate announcements, and determine whether boarding followed company policies. She had a full hour to quietly observe, cross-reference details, and mentally prepare for the inspection. Tension flickered when Ebony noticed the gate agent. The woman's name tag read Cheryl. Her body language radiated impatience. She snapped at an elderly couple inquiring about carry-on rules and rolled her eyes as they walked away. Sitting nearby, Ebony could practically feel the irritation coming off Cheryl in waves. Next, a man in a suit approached, asking to board early to store a large garment bag. Cheryl responded brusquely but ultimately let him through after scanning his pass. Ebony reminded herself that customer service, especially early in the day, could be challenging. She made a mental note to pay close attention to how Cheryl treated different passengers. When the first-class boarding announcement came, Ebony stood in line behind a tall blonde woman in a sharp business outfit. Ahead of them, a father with 2 young children also queued up, though Ebony suspected they were meant for the family boarding group. The line advanced quickly. The blonde woman passed through with a smile and a nod from Cheryl. The father received some mild resistance, but after a brief check, he and his kids were allowed to board, albeit without much friendliness. Then it was Ebony's turn. She offered her boarding pass with a warm, "Good morning." Cheryl barely glanced at the ticket before responding, her voice as cold as ice. "You're not in this line." Ebony's brow lifted. "I have a first-class ticket. This is the priority lane, isn't it?" Cheryl's eyes swept over Ebony in a way that made her feel judged, scrutinized, and somehow disqualified. "The next group hasn't been called yet." Cheryl replied, firm and unyielding. Ebony noticed the atmosphere shift. The usual airport noise hushed, replaced by the silence of nearby passengers straining to listen. She kept her voice level. From what I heard, first-class boarding has already started. Here's my ticket, she said, extending it again. It clearly says seat 2A, first class. Cheryl sighed, her irritation clearly rising. It was impossible for her not to see Ebony's seat assignment, yet she kept searching for an excuse to deny her boarding. Ebony felt the tension twist in her stomach, that all too familiar ache of subtle bias. She was well aware that gate agents usually scanned boarding passes immediately. The fact that Cheryl was simply staring at her name and seat number without scanning it was, in itself, a red flag. Ebony realized she couldn't let this slide. She would remain courteous, but unwavering. Cheryl's final effort to brush her off came out in a cold whisper. Ma'am, the next group is economy, and that's where you should be queuing. Please don't hold up the priority lane. The ambient noise had now faded into near silence, as fellow travelers looked on with focused attention. Ebony inhaled deeply, trying to steady her nerves. Her cheeks grew warm with restrained anger. Should she reveal her FAA credentials? No, that wasn't how she intended to begin this trip. She was on a covert assignment, an essential part of her role. Ebony chose to follow procedure, respond the way any regular paying customer would, and document everything carefully. Surprisingly, not a single person in the line spoke up for her. Perhaps they were shocked or lacked full understanding. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved. Ebony saw pity in one woman's eyes, confusion in a man's. The father she had noticed earlier glanced over briefly, then looked away. Ebony wasn't necessarily surprised. She had learned not to rely on bystanders. Still, the feeling of isolation stirred beneath her composed exterior. Looking Cheryl directly in the eye, Ebony said again calmly, I'm in seat 2A. She pointed to the clearly printed words first class on her boarding pass. I'd appreciate it if you honored the ticket I purchased. Her voice trembled just slightly from emotion, but her tone stayed composed. Cheryl's gaze flicked over Ebony's appearance. Tailored black blazer, matching slacks. Nothing like the sweatpants or leggings many passengers traveled in. There was nothing remotely suspicious about her attire. In fact, Ebony looked completely professional. Yet she could see the prejudice in Cheryl's rigid posture, the tight line of her mouth, the stubborn expression that silently screamed, you don't belong here. At last, with a dramatic air of reluctance, Cheryl scanned the boarding pass. The confirming beep rang out, somehow louder than usual. A few onlookers exhaled softly and turned back to their phones. Cheryl didn't say another word. She merely stepped aside. Ebony was finally allowed to board, but the damage had been done. On the jet bridge, she closed her eyes for a moment. Her heart was pounding, part fury, part sorrow. But she needed to focus. She was here for a mission. Ironically, the entire incident might now become a key part of her report. As she entered the plane, Ebony tried to shake off the incident. She mentally noted, gate agent attempted to block legitimate first-class passenger from boarding. She reminded herself that her job was not to seek personal retribution, but to ensure accountability. Still, she was human and the hurt lingered. The serenity of the first-class cabin gave her a brief sense of calm. Soft leather seats, clean lighting overhead, and a friendly flight attendant waiting near the aisle. Good morning. Welcome aboard, said the flight attendant, whose name tag read Carlos. He offered her a warm, genuine smile. Ebony returned a polite nod, trying to regulate her breathing. She slid into seat 2A, placed her carry-on above, and tucked her personal bag beneath the seat in front of her. As she sat, her thoughts kept racing. She reflected on the FAA training she had undergone, training not just on mechanics or certifications, but on the nuances of customer experience and staff professionalism. Federal rules covered everything from maintenance checks to passenger treatment. And while her area of expertise was operational safety, the FAA paid attention when staff behavior risked generating complaints. Discriminatory conduct wasn't just unethical. It could lead to lawsuits and steep penalties, especially if it revealed a pattern. Her phone buzzed. A text from her FAA supervisor. A routine check-in. Let me know if you spot anything unusual. Safe travels. Ebony gave a bitter half-smile. If only they knew, she thought before replying. All good so far. Flight departing soon. We'll follow up. As the rest of the passengers boarded, Ebony noticed the father and two kids seated a few rows back in economy, just beyond the curtain. She took stock of the crowd, suit-clad professionals, families, travelers in hoodies, elderly couples. The seat beside her remained vacant, and she figured it might stay that way unless someone arrived last minute. First-class seats sometimes went unclaimed on weekday flights. The attendants made the standard pre-flight announcements: store your laptops, switch devices to airplane mode. Ebony fastened her seatbelt with a fluid motion she had repeated countless times. But the anxiety from the gate encounter still clung to her like static. Cheryl had vanished, likely returning to the desk for final boarding duties. Ebony wondered if Cheryl had the slightest inkling that she had tried to humiliate someone with the authority to file a serious complaint. Probably not. People who make snap judgments rarely think about the consequences. Ebony resolved to include Cheryl's behavior in her formal notes, not out of spite, but because it was her responsibility to report accurately. If she let this go without mention, what would stop Cheryl from doing the same or worse to someone else? Just as Ebony expected the plane to begin taxiing away from the gate, she sensed a jolt. It wasn't physical turbulence, but rather a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor mechanical issue that requires further inspection before we can depart. We apologize for the inconvenience. Please remain seated, and we'll keep you informed. A collective groan rippled through the cabin. Ebony's curiosity, however, was piqued. A mechanical issue could mean a range of things: a flickering warning light, a misread hydraulic pressure level, or even something as minor as a jammed cargo latch. These types of delays weren't rare, but Ebony's mind instinctively switched to investigative mode. She had authorization to perform on-site assessments at her discretion, particularly when mechanical concerns arose. While maintenance crews typically handled such matters, Ebony had the legal authority to observe or step in if she found it necessary. Carlos, the first-class flight attendant, made his way down the aisle offering water and juice to ease the tension among passengers. Ebony accepted a small cup, all the while scanning the expressions around her. Most travelers appeared irritated by the delay. Some, likely with tight connections in Dallas, were glued to their phones trying to adjust their plans. Ebony, in contrast, calmly observed the behavior of the crew. Every passenger in the cabin was being treated with courtesy, a sharp contrast to how she had been handled at the gate. She heard low voices from the cockpit, the door still partially ajar. While she knew better than to openly eavesdrop, her seat in 2A gave her a clear line of sight and sound. Pilots often discussed last-minute procedures, system statuses, and updates with ground control, but Ebony detected tension in the tone of the conversation, something more than the usual back and forth between crew and mechanics. Moments later, a maintenance technician boarded, his reflective vest brushing against aisle seats as he made his way to the cockpit. Ebony watched carefully, sipping her drink, a knot of unease forming in her gut. She knew that sometimes pressure from airline management pushed crews to prioritize an on-time departure over a thorough inspection. Gate agents might also rush boarding to meet tight schedules. The FAA constantly emphasized safety over schedule, but Ebony had seen firsthand that not everyone lived by that rule. As the technician disappeared into the cockpit, Ebony debated whether she should reveal her position as an FAA inspector. Standard procedure advised staying undercover unless there was an immediate safety concern requiring federal oversight. She decided to give the crew a moment to handle the issue professionally on their own. Still, Ebony strongly believed in the motto, trust but verify. In the middle of her internal debate, Carlos returned. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowered. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset during boarding. Is everything okay? If there's anything I can do to make the flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate." His tone was sincere, his concern clear, something Ebony genuinely appreciated. She offered him a faint smile. "Thank you. I really appreciate it. I just had a rough encounter at the gate. But you've been very kind." "I'm all right now," Carlos nodded, glancing around to ensure no one was listening before continuing in a hushed tone. "I only bring it up because I saw how Cheryl treated you. You're not the first passenger to have issues with her," he said carefully. "She's had warnings before about her attitude. I've even seen her be rude to elderly passengers who struggle to walk quickly. I wish the airline would take action." Ebony's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Has she ever been officially reported?" Carlos lowered his voice further. "Yes, a few passengers have filed complaints, but she's still here. So either nothing ever came of it or someone higher up is protecting her. Honestly, it feels like the system only acts when something serious happens." Ebony thanked him, her mind racing. If Cheryl's behavior was part of a broader pattern, perhaps it was time for something serious to happen. She mentally added a note to check the airline's internal reports, see if there was any documented history of complaints against gate agents like Cheryl. Even though Ebony's main focus was on flight operations, discriminatory behavior by airline personnel could warrant a wider review by the Department of Transportation, or even trigger a civil rights audit if patterns were found. Several minutes later, the technician emerged, walking briskly past the first-class rows. Ebony caught fragments of conversation. "Sensors not giving a proper read. Might be faulty. We'll need to run a full check on the system." Then came the captain's voice. "We're on a tight timeline. Do what you can." This was exactly the kind of situation Ebony had been trained to evaluate. When pilots balanced mechanical alerts against scheduling pressure, it introduced risk. Ebony stood slowly and signaled Carlos. "Would it be possible for me to have a quick word with the pilot?" she asked, subtly implying it was official business. Carlos looked momentarily puzzled, then understanding dawned on his face. Of course. Let me check with them first," he said, heading toward the cockpit. Moments later, Ebony was waved forward. The captain, a grizzled man with a composed demeanor, turned slightly in his seat. "Hi there, I'm Captain Miles," he greeted her. Not unfriendly, but with a trace of impatience. He likely assumed she was another passenger complaining about the holdup. "Is everything all right?" Ebony discreetly displayed her FAA credentials, making sure nearby passengers couldn't see. "I'm Ebony Baxter, FAA," she said in a low voice. "I'm performing a routine, unannounced inspection. I happened to be on board during the delay and wanted to verify that everything is being addressed according to proper procedure." For a brief second, she thought she noticed a flicker of apprehension on Captain Miles's face, but he quickly regained composure. "Of course, Miss Baxter," he replied. "We're dealing with a sensor malfunction. My first officer and I noticed it during our pre-flight inspection," the captain explained. "The maintenance crew is trying to determine whether the sensor is giving a false alert or if there's an actual issue with the system. It's routine procedure, but I understand your desire to verify." Ebony gave a nod. "I appreciate your transparency." She noticed the first officer, a younger woman with keen eyes, glancing nervously between Ebony and the flight instruments. Ebony offered her a polite nod as well. "I'll stay out of your way," she added. "But let me know if there's anything you need from me." The captain cleared his throat. "Of course." Returning to her seat, Ebony considered that if the issue persisted, she might step off the aircraft for a more thorough inspection alongside the maintenance team. The airline's standard operating procedures outlined a maximum allowable window to resolve such discrepancies before switching aircraft or initiating a lengthy delay. Ebony kept an eye on the time. Meanwhile, other passengers grew increasingly uneasy. 10 minutes later, an announcement came over the PA system. "Folks, we're almost done with the checks. We appreciate your continued patience." Ebony could feel the frustration swell around her. The father seated behind her tried to soothe his restless children. A couple of rows ahead, an elderly man voiced his displeasure to a flight attendant about missing his connecting flight. Ebony pressed her lips together. She sympathized, travel interruptions were always stressful. But she decided not to sit by passively any longer. Rising from her seat, She approached the front and quietly asked a different flight attendant if she could briefly speak to the lead maintenance technician. The crew member, seemingly aware, likely informed by Carlos, that Ebony held authority, promptly escorted her off the plane and onto the jet bridge. There, she spotted a lean, middle-aged man in a neon safety vest, intently studying a checklist on his tablet. "Excuse me," Ebony said politely. "I'm Ebony Baxter with the FAA. I understand you're evaluating a sensor malfunction?" The man looked up, momentarily startled, but then gave a courteous nod. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Joseph Rodriguez, lead technician on this shift. We're nearly finished. Initial tests suggest the sensor itself is faulty, not the actual system, but we're double-checking." Ebony gestured to the tablet. "Mind if I take a look at the logs?" Joseph hesitated briefly, then handed over the device. Ebony quickly reviewed the standard fault codes. The faulty component was an external flap sensor that detects whether specific control surfaces are locked for takeoff. She exhaled quietly. If the flaps were functioning properly and the sensor alone was giving a false indication, the fix was relatively straightforward. The airline had discretion to replace or bypass the sensor, provided the flaps themselves were physically confirmed to be operational. Still, Ebony reminded herself that her responsibility was to ensure that no steps were skipped. "I see," she murmured, handing the tablet back. "Have you physically tested the flap deployment?" Joseph nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am. We performed a full extension on the ground. Everything's responding as it should. We also visually verified that there are no mechanical blockages. We're just waiting for clearance that the faulty sensor won't cause any false alarms during the flight." Ebony felt reassured. "Understood. I appreciate your thoroughness. Let's make sure everyone gets airborne safely." As she reboarded the plane, Ebony sensed a subtle tension among the crew. Word had clearly circulated that an FAA inspector was on board. The captain and first officer remained professional but visibly more cautious. Carlos and the other attendants stood straighter and chose their words more carefully. Ebony understood the effect her presence had. It carried weight. She represented regulatory authority and the potential for audits or penalties. But she didn't want that to overshadow the primary purpose of the flight. This was supposed to be a routine experience for every passenger. Settling back into her seat, Ebony reminded herself that the gate agent's behavior earlier was still fresh in her mind. Whether she would formally report it remained a question she hadn't fully answered. Yes, she had the authority, but she also valued fairness. If the airline addressed the issue internally and provided adequate training, that might suffice. Yet Ebony's instincts told her Cheryl's behavior was not an isolated event. Shortly after, Joseph signaled from the jet bridge with a thumbs up toward the cockpit, confirming the sensor replacement or override had been completed. Captain Miles announced over the intercom that they would be departing shortly. A wave of relief swept through the cabin. Seat belts clicked. Flight attendants began the safety demonstration, and Ebony couldn't help but notice how especially clear and professional Carlos was while explaining emergency procedures. Finally, the plane pulled back from the gate. The engines thundered to life, and Ebony felt that familiar surge as the aircraft raced down the runway. She always cherished that moment, when the wheels left the ground and reality seemed to lift with them. It reminded her of the marvels of modern engineering, how human creativity and precision allowed people to rise into the skies. As the plane climbed above the clouds, Ebony looked out the window. The Atlanta skyline faded beneath a layer of white. She allowed her shoulders to relax. Though she still had a job to do, she now had a few hours to gather her thoughts, reflect on the incident at the gate, and plan her next steps once they landed in Dallas. Perhaps she would conduct a standard in-flight inspection, quietly checking lavatories and ensuring emergency equipment was properly stowed. She'd do it subtly so as not to alarm passengers. After reaching cruising altitude, beverage service began. Carlos returned and offered Ebony a complimentary drink, which she accepted with a nod of gratitude. Just a sparkling water. As Ebony took a sip, she heard a sudden cough from someone in the row behind her. She turned slightly to check if everything was all right. The father with the two children was rummaging through the seatback pockets in search of an airsickness bag. Ebony gave him a sympathetic look. Traveling with young kids was already challenging. Adding mechanical delays and motion sickness created a perfect storm of stress. The seat belt sign illuminated sooner than expected. The pilot's voice came over the speakers. "We're encountering some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until the sign is turned off." Ebony's senses heightened. Unexpected turbulence wasn't unusual, especially when flying through certain weather zones, but she always paid close attention to how the crew responded. The flight attendants promptly secured the beverage carts and moved down the aisles, checking that all passengers were seated and buckled. Carlos navigated swiftly, assisting wherever needed. Ebony observed carefully. Every flight attendant remained composed, professional, and clear in their directions. These minor in-flight disruptions, Ebony thought, often revealed the true strength of a crew. She quickly jotted down a note in the small notepad she kept tucked in her blazer. "Cabin crew, excellent, coordinated, well-prepared, calm during turbulence." She underlined it. It was important to remember that not all staff were failing in their roles. Quite the opposite. As the aircraft gently rocked, Ebony found herself reflecting on the dynamics of authority between herself, the airline employees, and the passengers. A few words in her report could affect someone's career trajectory. Yet she never took that power lightly. She was there to ensure safety and fairness, not to instill fear. She wished employees like Cheryl understood that. Her mind drifted again to the gate agent's blatant discrimination. The memory reignited a flicker of anger, but she contained it. She'd address it at the appropriate time. Once the turbulence passed and the seatbelt sign turned off, Ebony discreetly decided to begin her in-flight inspection. Typically, she reserved this for longer flights, but given the mechanical delay and the tension she'd sensed, she wanted to be thorough. She gave Carlos a subtle signal. He nodded in understanding and granted her access to the galley. Slipping behind the curtain that separated first class from the service area, Ebony pulled out her notepad and began checking emergency equipment. Portable oxygen tanks, life vests, fire extinguishers, and the medical kit. She cross-checked the inventory. Everything was accounted for. She peeked inside the compartment where crew members stored personal items and extra supplies. Spotless. Ebony also scanned the alignment of cabin seats and ensured that safety cards were properly placed. Everything appeared up to code. As a final step, she approached Carlos to ask about the crew's training status. Normally, she'd do that on the ground, but she wanted a quick verbal confirmation. "How recent was your last recurrent training?" she asked softly. 3 months ago, Carlos replied. "We're required to do them annually, plus we get additional refreshers for specific procedures." Ebony gave a satisfied nod. "Thank you for your cooperation." She returned to her seat, wishing the rest of the flight experience had been equally seamless. Sinking back into seat 2A, Ebony tried to let her mind rest, but she couldn't. The confrontation with Cheryl kept playing in her head. The way embarrassment could snowball, the way one moment could ruin someone's entire travel experience. Ebony had the resilience and the professional authority to handle it. But what if someone else, another passenger, was faced with that same hostility without her fortitude or position? She knew she had to take action, but how to proceed in a way that brought meaningful change, not just a temporary reprimand. A lone complaint, even from someone at the FAA, might not result in lasting consequences if Cheryl's supervisors were apathetic or overly protective. Ebony had seen it before. Reports lost in endless bureaucracy, complications from union involvement, airlines burying problems to avoid public attention. Ebony didn't just want accountability. She wanted a shift, a fundamental change in how certain employees treated Black travelers or anyone perceived as out of place in first class. Amid her thoughts, Ebony realized the seat beside her, 2B, was now occupied by a man dressed in business casual. She'd been so focused that she hadn't noticed when he sat down. He looked like a standby passenger or someone upgraded last minute. Now, he regarded her with a curious expression. "Excuse me," he said gently, leaning in. "I couldn't help but notice. Back at the gate, it seemed like you had some difficulty boarding." His tone carried concern, not intrusion. Ebony gave a measured smile. Yes, the gate agent mistakenly told me I was in the wrong line, but it's been resolved. She kept her response brief, uncertain of his intent. He extended a hand.
I'm Tristan Keller.
I've been flying for business for about 15 years now. Honestly, I've seen things like that happen before. It's never okay. Ebony shook his hand, feeling a subtle sense of relief that at least one fellow passenger had noticed and cared. Ebony Baxter, she replied. I'm traveling for work as well. She didn't elaborate. Tristan nodded. Well, I'm sorry you had to go through that. People can be petty. If it helps, I know there are ways to report those incidents. My cousin works in HR for a major airline, and I've heard that repeated complaints do carry weight. Don't just let it slide if it really affected you. Ebony studied him for a moment, assessing his sincerity. He seemed genuine, perhaps even a little unsure of whether he was overstepping. She appreciated that. Thanks. I'll think about it, Ebony replied. It's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to experience that kind of treatment. Tristan nodded, then shifted in his seat, returning to his book, which Ebony noticed was about leadership techniques. She made a mental note. Not everyone in first class was silently complicit in tolerating discrimination. Some, even in small ways, wanted to help. The remainder of the flight went by without any disturbances. Ebony reviewed FAA guidelines on her tablet, scanning for updates to certain safety procedures. She also mentally rehearsed her post-landing plan. Conduct a quick review of the flight, log any irregularities, and then check in with the local FAA office in Dallas. She intended to remain in the city for a day or two, examining other scheduled flights and potentially reviewing some training documentation. But her thoughts repeatedly circled back to the incident at the gate. When the pilot announced their descent into Dallas-Fort Worth, Ebony felt the familiar pressure in her ears. She looked out the window at the sprawling cityscape below. The earlier tension had lessened, but hadn't vanished completely. As the plane landed smoothly, Ebony silently praised the flight crew for their well-executed approach. A chorus of seatbelt clicks echoed as passengers began gathering their belongings. Ebony didn't rush. Once the cabin door opened, she spotted Cheryl step on board momentarily, likely to handle some arrival documentation. The sight of her made Ebony's pulse quicken. She resisted the impulse to confront Cheryl immediately. Instead, Ebony stood calmly, waited for the aisle to clear, and made her way toward the exit. To her surprise, as she exited the aircraft, she saw Cheryl standing at the end of the jet bridge, talking with another airline staffer. Cheryl glanced at Ebony with an almost anxious expression, as if anticipating Ebony might speak up. The presence of another employee seemed to deter Cheryl from initiating conversation. Ebony debated whether to walk past or address her directly. She chose to maintain her composure and pass by silently. But then something unexpected happened. Cheryl gently grabbed Ebony's arm. Not aggressively, but enough to stop her. Ebony stiffened. She turned slowly and met Cheryl's gaze. Yes, Ebony asked, her voice composed. Cheryl's face wavered between nervousness and defensiveness. Look, I didn't mean earlier. I was just following procedure for boarding groups. Ebony held her gaze. And your procedure was to deny a legitimate first-class passenger boarding privileges? Repeatedly, she spoke softly, careful not to draw attention from others exiting the plane. Cheryl cast a glance at her colleague, who was now observing them. Well, maybe there was a misunderstanding. We get a lot of people trying to sneak into priority. Ebony heard the weak justification, but also detected a hint of apology. She kept her tone steady. My ticket clearly indicated first class. There was no misunderstanding on my end. Cheryl looked as though she had more to say, but Ebony gave a curt nod and moved on, unwilling to prolong the encounter in front of an audience. As she walked briskly down the jet bridge and into the terminal, Ebony's thoughts swirled. Was Cheryl attempting a sincere apology, or just trying to avoid consequences? Either way, Ebony understood that her next actions would determine whether the airline truly felt the weight of what had occurred. Ebony found a seat near a window and pulled out her phone. She composed a concise but thorough message to her supervisor at the FAA's Dallas office, detailing the aircraft's mechanical delay and confirming that the crew had adhered to standard procedures. In a separate message, she outlined the situation with the gate agent, clearly stating that she had been denied priority boarding and describing Cheryl's behavior. Ebony emphasized that it might suggest a recurring pattern of discriminatory conduct. She noted that Carlos had mentioned Cheryl had received previous complaints. Ebony requested guidance on whether to escalate the issue through the Department of Transportation or handle it internally through FAA channels, which sometimes coordinated with an airline's compliance division. After hitting send, Ebony closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The morning had been mentally and emotionally taxing. She still had a few hours before her scheduled lunch with a local FAA colleague. For now, she decided to decompress, maybe grab a coffee, and let her adrenaline subside. While walking through the terminal, she spotted Tristan from first class. He was on the phone, likely arranging transportation. He noticed her, gave a small wave, and Ebony returned it, appreciating the quiet gesture of solidarity. Soon, she found a cafe and settled at a quiet corner table. Sipping her latte, she continued reading through the FAA's updated policies on passenger rights and equality. The more she read, the more convinced she became that a full investigation was necessary. Gate agents and airline staff were often the first point of passenger interaction. Ebony reasoned that systemic change needed to begin at that level if fairness was ever going to be genuinely upheld. Her lunch meeting was with Geraldine "Jerry" Stanley, a longtime colleague who managed the FAA's regional operations in Dallas. They met at a casual restaurant inside the airport, choosing a quieter table to talk. Ebony opened the conversation by reviewing the mechanical delay. Jerry, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s, nodded without concern. That part sounds routine enough. Good to hear they handled the sensor issue properly. Then Ebony brought up the gate agent situation. Jerry's expression darkened. Cheryl, you said? The gate agent's name was Cheryl? Yes, Ebony confirmed. And from what I gathered, it wasn't an isolated incident. Jerry exhaled sharply, her face serious. You know, Ebony, the FAA doesn't usually deal with discrimination complaints unless they intersect with safety. That typically falls under the DOT's Consumer Protection Unit or the airline's internal HR. But if you witnessed it firsthand, that carries more weight. We can't just brush it off. Ebony traced the edge of her water glass thoughtfully. Carlos, the flight attendant, mentioned there have been previous complaints. And still, nothing seems to have changed. Jerry gave a resigned shrug. Airlines tend to move slowly unless there's a financial penalty or a PR scandal. You know how it is. She leaned in slightly. Now, in your official capacity, if you want to escalate this, we can make it part of a larger compliance audit. It wouldn't just focus on that one gate agent. We could examine training protocols, how complaints are resolved, the full scope. That's a bigger move than you might think, Ebony. Ebony nodded, resolute. I understand, but I can't keep overlooking these smaller incidents, especially when they're symptoms of a larger issue. Jerry reached out and gently tapped Ebony's hand. All right, I'll see what I can do, but you'll need to submit a formal statement. Ebony, names, times, specific details. You'll also have to mention that you were traveling in an undercover capacity for official reasons. Are you comfortable with that? Ebony swallowed. That meant her anonymity as an inspector would be compromised. Word could easily spread among airline personnel that Ebony Baxter was someone to be wary of. But her sense of justice wouldn't allow her to ignore what had happened. Yes, she said, I'm okay with it. After finishing lunch with Jerry, Ebony made her way to the baggage claim area to collect her suitcase. Her plan was to head to a nearby hotel and get some rest before the next day's scheduled aircraft inspections. But upon reaching the baggage area, she noticed a small cluster of passengers from her flight still waiting for their luggage. She spotted the father who had traveled with his children. They were dealing with missing or delayed bags. Ebony overheard him speaking to another traveler. Yeah, the gate agent was off, the father said. I saw her turn away a lady in first class. She definitely came across as biased. Ebony's attention sharpened. She moved closer and introduced herself politely. "Excuse me, I'm Ebony. We were on the same flight, right?" The man, who introduced himself as Damien, nodded. "Yes, sorry, I was just venting about that gate agent. I think she's the reason my kids and I were treated so poorly. We asked for early boarding. Traveling with little ones is chaotic. But she told us we should have arrived earlier. We were on time, but she made us wait until the later groups. My kids are 5 and 8. It was a struggle." He sighed. "We travel often, but she made things harder than they needed to be." Ebony gave a sympathetic nod. "I'm sorry you went through that. Did you file a complaint?" Damien shook his head. "We just want to get home. Filing complaints feels pointless. Unless someone actually follows through, it all just disappears." Ebony felt a pang in her chest. He was right. Many passengers stayed silent because they assumed it wouldn't matter. And that made her realize that her decision to escalate the incident wasn't just about her own experience. It was about speaking up for others who never would. That evening, settled into her modest but comfortable hotel room overlooking a bustling freeway, Ebony spread out her notes on the small desk and started mapping out a plan of action. The FAA had granted her permission to conduct a surprise inspection the next morning at the same airline's gates and facilities at Dallas-Fort Worth. Normally, Ebony would focus strictly on operational checks, crew records, maintenance logs, emergency equipment. But in light of what had happened earlier, she intended to expand her scope. She wanted to observe the gate agents during peak hours, specifically to determine whether the discriminatory conduct was isolated or part of a larger trend. She typed up her formal statement detailing the incident from that morning. She included Cheryl's name, the time, the flight number, and the refusal to allow her to board with a legitimate first-class ticket. Ebony ended the report by formally requesting FAA cooperation with the Department of Transportation to investigate potential bias or misconduct patterns at that airline's gates. Reading over the completed statement, Ebony felt a sense of resolve. She was doing what needed to be done. By 6 a.m. the following day, Ebony was back at the airport with renewed focus. Carrying her FAA credentials, she met up with Jerry and another FAA official named Mark. Together, they approached the airline's management desk to initiate the unannounced inspections. Ebony noticed the flicker of concern in the station manager's expression. Surprise FAA visits always made staff nervous. But Ebony maintained a calm and professional demeanor. She requested access to the gates with imminent departures, particularly to review how priority boarding, passenger assistance, and staff behavior were being handled. After a brief hesitation, the station manager agreed and escorted them through security. Ebony couldn't help the slight smirk that crossed her face. It was always impressive how cooperative management became once they realized the FAA meant business. At Gate 19, Ebony spotted a familiar face, Cheryl. She hadn't expected to see her again so soon, but apparently Cheryl had been assigned to the Dallas station. Or perhaps she was there for a shift exchange. Regardless, Ebony's pulse quickened. She had prepared to observe a random gate, but fate had brought her right back to the woman who had denied her boarding. Cheryl was working the desk for a flight to Los Angeles. The line of waiting passengers curved around the gate seating area. A few travelers appeared to be stepping up to ask about seating or luggage. Cheryl's demeanor was cold, her tone clipped. Ebony exchanged a meaningful glance with Jerry, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, this just got interesting." They approached together, Ebony in the lead. The moment Cheryl recognized her, a flash of alarm crossed her face. Ebony noticed the tension in her shoulders. She stepped forward, speaking with composed authority. "Good morning, Miss Cheryl. I'm Ebony Baxter with the FAA. My colleagues and I are conducting an inspection. We'd like to observe the boarding process and speak with you about your standard procedures." Cheryl tried to compose herself. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Good morning, of course. Is this about yesterday?" Ebony replied, keeping her voice low to avoid alarming passengers. "It's about ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations, including the fair and equal treatment of passengers. We'll also be reviewing general operational practices." Jerry stepped in, flashing her own badge. "We'll just observe for now, ask a few questions, and watch how the boarding process is handled. Cheryl nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. This way, please. She gestured toward a side desk where Ebony and Jerry could stand without interfering with the flow of boarding passengers. Over the next 30 minutes, Ebony and Jerry observed closely as boarding began for the Los Angeles flight. First came pre-boarding for travelers needing extra time or assistance. Cheryl made the standard announcements, her tone now noticeably courteous. Ebony noted the contrast from the previous day. Clearly, Cheryl was on her best behavior under scrutiny. Then came the call for first class and priority boarding. A black couple stepped forward. Ebony held her breath. Cheryl scanned their boarding passes quickly and let them proceed without issue. Ebony narrowed her eyes. Had Cheryl genuinely changed, or was she simply putting on a performance? Then a hiccup occurred. Another passenger approached, claiming he had priority boarding status, but Cheryl insisted his pass showed Group 2, not priority. The man pushed back, saying he was a frequent flyer with elite status. Ebony observed closely as Cheryl asked for his membership number, entered it into the system, confirmed his status, and allowed him through with a polite apology. Ebony could hardly believe this was the same woman from the day before. The contrast was striking. It suggested Cheryl knew exactly how to act, but at times simply chose not to. Once the final passengers had boarded, Ebony and Jerry requested a brief conversation with Cheryl regarding her training and procedures. Cheryl responded with all the standard corporate phrases, stating she valued customer service, had received training on priority boarding, and that the airline upheld a strict zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination. Her delivery was polished, but Ebony could sense the tightness in Cheryl's stance, as if bracing for Ebony to push back. At last, Ebony decided to address the matter directly. She opened her notepad. Miss Cheryl, you remember me from yesterday. You initially refused to let me board, despite my valid first-class ticket. It wasn't a misunderstanding. My boarding pass clearly indicated seat 2A. Can you explain why that happened? Cheryl's eyes flicked toward Jerry, who maintained a neutral expression, then back to Ebony. I thought there might have been a glitch in the system, she stammered. We were having issues with some boarding passes that morning. I didn't mean to offend. Ebony pressed, her voice even. You denied me several times, even after I clarified that I had the correct ticket. Cheryl fidgeted, wringing her hands. I'm sorry if it came across that way. I was just following the procedures as best I could. Ebony felt a quiet fire burning inside. She kept her tone steady. Procedures don't tell you to ignore a clearly marked first-class ticket. Procedures don't instruct you to judge who looks like they belong in first class and who doesn't. Her gaze locked on Cheryl's. I've spoken to other passengers and even one of your co-workers. This wasn't an isolated incident. Cheryl's face went pale. For a second, Ebony thought she saw her eyes start to water. Whether from fear or guilt, she couldn't tell. I'm sorry, Cheryl said again, voice quivering. It's been a lot lately, with everything going on. I didn't mean to. I never. Jerry stepped in gently. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. The FAA, in collaboration with other agencies, will be conducting a thorough review. Do you understand? Cheryl nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked both apologetic and terrified. Ebony sensed she was on the verge of tears, but she couldn't summon sympathy, not yet. Her focus was on justice, not punishment. Thank you for your cooperation, Ebony said curtly. Word spread quickly among the airline staff that an unexpected FAA inspection was underway, possibly triggered by a discrimination-related complaint. Other gate agents stood straighter. Flight attendants walking through the terminal wore nervous but overly bright smiles. Several supervisors lingered nearby, likely to offer assistance or to monitor Ebony and Jerry's every move. Ebony found it telling that the mere threat of consequences triggered such a noticeable boost in professionalism and courtesy. It said a lot about how accountability could drive improvement. She and Jerry continued their work, interviewing several gate agents about how often they receive training in non-discrimination, conflict management, and support for diverse passengers. Most admitted the training was annual and minimal. We just do an online module, watch a couple of short videos, and answer multiple choice questions. That's it, one agent confessed. Ebony nodded, jotting down notes. The training clearly wasn't comprehensive enough to address deep-seated biases. Meanwhile, Mark, the other FAA official, conducted checks on the operational side, reviewing arrival and departure logs, verifying crew assignments, and ensuring no corners were being cut amid the daily hustle. The teamwork between Ebony, Jerry, and Mark proved to be a strong force for oversight. By late morning, they had gathered enough information to start drafting a detailed report. Ebony hoped it would lead to meaningful change, not just a slap on the wrist. By noon, Ebony was both physically and emotionally drained. She found a quiet corner of the terminal to sit and collect her thoughts. Jerry approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ebony with a tired but content smile. "So, how are you feeling?" she asked. Ebony took a sip, grateful. "Better. I think we sent a clear message that the FAA cares not just about aircraft safety, but also about passengers' rights. And maybe the airline will finally take Cheryl's actions seriously. Still, this is only one step. It doesn't erase years of frustration, mine or anyone else's." Jerry squeezed her shoulder. "One step leads to many more. I'll make sure our report highlights the need for stronger training and better oversight." The airline's leadership looked rattled enough to take this seriously. Ebony nodded. "Good." She paused, thinking of her parents' proud faces whenever she spoke about her work. They had always taught her that being a black woman in a position of authority came with the duty to stand up against injustice. And today, Ebony had done just that. A few days later, the airline announced a complete overhaul of its gate agent training program. New, stricter policies for managing priority boarding would be implemented, along with a reinforced zero-tolerance stance on discriminatory conduct. Cheryl, facing multiple documented complaints, was placed on indefinite leave pending further investigation. Ebony never took pleasure in someone else's downfall, but she believed in consequences. Sometimes, karma comes not in silence, but with the voice of unwavering justice. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt mistreated or witnessed bias, know that one voice, one determined person, can ignite important change. Let Ebony's story remind us that we must stand up for ourselves and for others, even when the odds feel overwhelming. Now, I'd like to invite you to take part in this message. Please like this video, share it with friends who need a story of resilience, and subscribe to this channel for more narratives that highlight truth and courage. Together, we can build a community rooted in fairness, empathy, and the strength to make a difference.